All right. Well, you guys are all here because you want to learn about Unreal Engine, obviously. So we're going to give you a little top-down view. We're not going to go too into depth with anything other than like the interface and how variables work. So that'll be future workshops that'll go more in depth on like specific stuff. This will be kind of like taking a dip into the pond in like every category. All right, so Unreal Engine is crazy big. Like, it's yeah, it's almost impossible to like understand every part of Unreal. Like there are people that are getting paid to develop games in Unreal Engine that still don't know every part of Unreal Engine. Has over 40,000 files just in the basic directories. Tons of lines of code. So the only way to really master it, and like mastery is a rough word there, is just to start at the bottom and learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it and just build up with that. So like basically what I'm trying to say is like it's really intimidating at the beginning, but if you just kind of work your way up, you'll slowly build on your knowledge of it and stuff will start to make sense faster because you have prior knowledge of like how the engine works. Pretty much everything works the same way in Unreal. You'll learn it, and it's like learning Photoshop for the first time. It's like pretty difficult at first, but once you get over that initial hump, you're like, oh, this is just like that. Kind of makes sense, right? Yeah. So this is a lot of words, but essentially this will help you later down the line when you're making your git ignores, which is basically like the files you don't want to upload to GitHub to reduce the size of your project. This is what all the different files in your project look like. I know it's a lot. You have your engine files, that's all your code and content. Project files, which is like the actual game project and all the settings. You have templates for creating new projects. And then all this big mumbo jumbo at the bottom are all the files that make your game what it is. The only really like important stuff to have in your actual project are your build files, your content, and your config. Other than that, they kind of just like, it's like a build file would be if you built your actual game for a computer so you could play it as an executable. You don't need to upload that to GitHub, obviously, because if someone else gets your project and wants to make it for their computer, they're not going to use your previous build because it won't work for their computer. Unless you like build for PC, get that exe and send it to them. But like if they're trying to use it on like a Mac or something like that, of course it's not going to work. So build files aren't really that important. Yeah, that's about it. So this is the game settings interface. You have different categories on the side for basically the biggest thing you're going to be looking at in the beginning stages of your game is input and maps and modes. So you can set your default map to be the one that you're editing, obviously. Like if you make a new map, you obviously don't want it to keep defaulting to the third person template map. And input allows you to set up different like inputs for axis and action events. So like an action event input is, say, press space, that's jump. And an axis event is when you want like movement with different values. So like if you're doing a look around axis event on like a joystick, of course that's going to have different values. Like say the y-axis on the joystick goes from -1 to 1. So if you want to turn slower, you'd press the joystick less. So that has an actual value attributed to it. Make sense? If you guys have any questions, feel free to just like say them. Like you don't have to like raise your hand, you can just ask. So this is what the actual interface looks like when you're in a project. I'm going to go through everything in the interface, what it does. So up here, this is going to be your best friend when you're learning Unreal. It's the tutorial button. It will walk you through literally every part of the interface. And it is a lifesaver when you don't know what you're doing. Then after that, source control will be our next workshop. So that's what that is. That allows you to integrate with Git, Mercurial, SVN, like other Git platforms. Then there's your content. marketplace that allows you to actually take content from another game or the marketplace and import it into your game. Then you have your settings, which will be on the next tab, because I actually click on that and show you all the different categories that are in that. Your blueprint settings for your game blueprint. Cinematics aren't important. We aren't making AAA titles. Then you have build, so you can actually build your game for an iPhone or a Mac or a laptop or whatever you want to build your game for. That'll be all in here. And then play, which is just obviously to test your game inside the engine. And the difference between play and launch is launch makes a build of your game and launches it as an executable without saving the executable. So build versus launch. Build you can reuse. Launch does it every time. So I know one example of when I had to use launch was when I was making my pause menu for my game. And if anybody's ever tested their game in here, you know if you press escape, it makes you exit. So if I want to look at my pause menu and I press escape in the play menu, every time I press escape, it would just exit the preview. So I had to build it so I could use escape to look at my pause menu. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Over here, you have all of the different objects that make up your actual map. So like right here, that's the floor, all the walls. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I think everyone's done some kind of 3D stuff before, so they understand how like a 3D space works, right? Okay. And then your content browser down here. This has all of your different files that make up your game. All your blueprints, all your animation blueprints, all your blend spaces. Basically everything that makes your game run. That's where most of the work starts, is like, okay, I have my third-person character blueprint. I want to give him just like a basic health variable that I can then modify with other mechanics in the game. So I'm going to open his third-person blueprint and add a variable on the side. It's literally that simple. Yeah, so I'm going to go over the settings tab now. So there's a lot of stuff in here. Basically, the only two you're going to have to worry about are world settings and project settings. You remember that big window that was up about 2 slides ago where it had input on the side? That is project settings. So when you're going to set up your inputs, you set them up in action events and axis events inside of input. And then when you're in your blueprint, you know how you can have an event that triggers something? Those axis events and action events will then show up when you look for them. And they'll be like, oh, action event, shoot. And you can have that trigger spawn a projectile and shoot. And your project settings are just settings for your actual map and how it exports, and say you want a splash screen at the beginning of your game. Less important at the beginning stages, more important towards the end. You can set your game description, stuff like that. So
okay,
yeah,
sorry.
No,
So here's the main thing about Unreal. It has a property called modularity, and this kind of makes you in control of what you export when you build the game, and it kind of promotes reusability, extensibility, maintainability, decoupling, and efficiency. Now this is all fancy talk for basically it streamlines your process. So modularity means modularity lets you exclude what you don't need from your project, or include something you do need, which I'll explain now. Unreal comes with a bunch of modules, be it for physics, be it for enhanced control, be it for a lot of different things. And you have to manually import them. but then again, you can choose to not import them, and this, of course, helps with the actual file size in the end.
Yeah, I know one thing about modularity that kind of stems from the computer science major is the idea of inheritance and reusability. So say you want a game where you have multiple different class types, like my RPG has a mage and a paladin. They both have the same movement, so why would I make that twice? So the best way to go about that kind of thing would be to make a blueprint class of your character, put all of its movement and all of the things that are used in both classes, and then make child actors from that so that they extend that and you don't have to program it twice. Does that make sense? Yes? Cool. Okay. So essentially, you don't want to code the same thing 4 times, because that wastes your time and it wastes file space in the game, because Unreal Engine is incredibly robust in the sense that it has so many different things you can use, but all those things that you're using take up space. And if you're doing a game jam and you want to submit your file and it's judged by all the people competing in the game jam, no one wants to download a game that's over 1 gigabyte, because in the end it might be terrible, it might be good, but they still have to download it. So size really matters when it comes to developing a game. So these are some examples of the different modules. Might be kind of nonsense right now, but it's good to know that they're there for you to use later down the line. So it uses the developer module in the actual editor, not in games. It uses the editor module in the editor, obviously. The runtime is used by when you're actually previewing the game and when you're launching it and building it. Then you have your third party, which is like external codes and basically the same thing as plugins, and your programs, which are like standalone applications. Makes sense. Let's see. Well, obviously, you can't have a dependency to the editor module because it isn't run in the game. Make sense? Runtime modules must not have dependencies to editor or developer modules, meaning you can't depend on something that is only used in the editor in your actual game when it's running, because the editor is only used in the editor. It's pretty simple. These are just like basic examples of what a module rule would be. If you aren't using, if your module isn't used in your game when it's running, you can't depend on something from it while it's running. So these are probably the most important modules for you to use as a beginner. The core is like fundamental types of functions and stuff like that, like basic math. The U object system is like you spawn a cube in your map that uses the U object system, has different programs and modules that you can use from it, like different functions. Then there's the engine, which is game classes and engine framework. The online subsystem is only really important if you're making a multiplayer game, like online, obviously. That's probably not that important right now. And the slate system, which makes up the entire blueprint library. That's probably the most important feature if you're getting into building a game in Unreal, because without the slate system, you'd have to program in C++. I know no one wants to do that. So these are some interesting, like, cool features for later down the line. I think probably the coolest one, in my opinion, is that you can add in-game Twitch streaming. I know that's in some games now, but the idea that you could make just like a basic indie RPG and have it able to stream straight to Twitch right from the game, just with a library that's already included in this free engine, that's really cool. Source control will be touched upon in the next workshop, but basically the gist of it is that you can commit your changes in the game to Git and then use an external Git source like a GUI to actually upload that to Git. So it's really simple, but definitely not something we want to touch in the same workshop because it's just too much stuff in one day. Yeah, so these are all other features you might use later down the line. So this is like building a project. So obviously you're going to start by making a new project. These are your templates. Has anybody ever like started building a project in Unreal yet from a template? No? Okay. Well, essentially you get all of these different templates with different stuff already built for you. Like with the first-person shooter, you get a player model that has the camera inside his face, so you can only see his arms when he's running. With the side scroller, the player is running like this, and the camera is to the side. Make sense? And all of these templates already have movement predefined for you, so you don't have to worry about that mechanic. So you just start the actual template, and you can just start playing the game already. All you have to do is develop the mechanics you want custom for your game. So like, if you're making a actually, I can talk about my game. I started with the third-person template, and then I developed melee mechanics. I developed projectile mechanics, and a simple AI, and that's about where we're at right now. I think it looks pretty good, but it wasn't that much work beyond the third-person template. So don't feel like you're like abusing the template to use it to expand upon your game, because in the end, most movement mechanics are pretty simple, but they don't really change from game to game. It's kind of like just, okay, I want to move forward, move my character forward, and tell his animation blueprint that he's moving forward so it can play the run animation. It's really that simple. Yeah, does anybody have any questions about like templates in general? No? Yeah, they're pretty simple. So this is what it looks like when you're trying to make a new project. This is a decently old version of Unreal in this picture, but essentially it's just all of those right here, but in like a grid instead of in a list. Like all those different templates that were in the previous slide, they're just stored in a grid. You just choose which one you want. Like if you want first person, if you want third person, side scroller. I don't know if anybody's making a puzzle game, but they have like a puzzle with like 3D pieces, which is pretty cool. They have one with a pre-made vehicle, which has a camera and everything, and like you can get in the vehicle and drive it. The physics for that aren't that good, but you can play around with it. And then over here you have the sample projects that you can get. I'm not sure if those are still included in 4.18 because I haven't seen them, but if they are, they're in there, and I haven't found them. So this comes later down the line once you have a game and you want to actually package it to be used in a computer or a phone, an Android or an iPhone, whatever you want to package it for. You have the actual packaging project right here. So say I want to export it for Windows. I do, obviously, Windows. And then I go through all my settings in here to decide, okay, I want this to be 1080p. I want it to run at these settings. And it's really about that simple. I mean, unless you dive into the advanced settings, it's basically just like quick exporting it and getting an exe in like 10 minutes once it's done building all your lighting and stuff like that. That's definitely one of the essential parts when you're building a game, is looking at how much lighting you're using, because that takes up the most space and it takes up the most processing power, is generating like dynamic lighting. Because if you have a light in front of you and you are regenerating the shadow as a character runs by it, it has to do calculations for every frame of like what your shadow would be, and that's a lot of math for it to do. So I don't know if you know what baking and lighting is, but it's essentially like, say I have a telephone pole, which I know is never going to move, but it casts a shadow on a wall. Then I just bake it in. So like, it isn't actually doing the calculation, it's just part of the texture of the wall, which is pretty cool. It saves a lot of runtime, even though it's not changing at all. It's just doing the same equation over and over again to figure out where the shadow is. So
okay, now for the actual meat of the
workshop.
Yeah, the workshop. And basically, this is basically where you input the logic into your games. So blueprints are basically anything in a character which changes during runtime. So it's comparable, well, it actually is, like visual scripting. And the blueprint, I don't know if there's a picture, but in the blueprints, they'll just give you a bunch of nodes. And the nodes can be, well, the 3 nodes that start are when a collision happens, when the object starts, and when a frame is rendered. And basically, you can set up your actual object so that with time or with input or with every collision, it will execute a command which you are to put into the blueprint.
So now we're going to actually show a demo in Unreal Engine. Also, all these sources for information will all be in an email sent to you, just so. And they'll probably also be on our Trello, which is definitely a good resource if you aren't already on it. So like I said, this is just the bare bones third-person template. It comes with movement, control the camera with your mouse, and there's jumping, and that has an animation. So this is like a really good place to start a game, this and their first-person template, if you're making a first-person game, obviously. So if you want to actually dive into creating a mechanic for your character, like I'm gonna make a little health variable that can change over time. First way you would do that is inside here. As you can see, this is our basic template. Like I haven't changed anything. All of this movement stuff right here. It's getting the rotation, breaking it, finding the rotator for yaw, because Z is turning like this. And it's getting its forward and right vector and adding it to the movement input of the character for moving forward and moving right, which would be turning and going that way. That makes sense, right? The basic math behind it, you don't have to fully understand it, but like, so this is that thing, the input axis I was talking about. So see how it has an axis value at the bottom? So if you're using like a joystick or something like that, that value is going to change from -1 to 1 in like decimal points. That's how you can have a character that, say, turns at a different rate as opposed to like just turning at its full speed. It's one of the benefits to developing a game for like a controller, is that you get a lot more range and movement because you can move slower as opposed to faster. So yeah, on the side over here, these are your variables. So to create a health system, we're going to start by creating a variable, call it health. And you can change the variable type on the side. We're going to do a float. So the reason we're doing a float, as in like a decimal point, is when we create a progress bar for health, it's going to measure the percentage of health based on a decimal from 0 to 1. So rather than doing the math and actually having to divide out like whatever its health is as an integer from 1 to 100 by 100 every time we show it on the screen, it's easier to just have it stored between 0 and 1 in like increments of 0.01. Make sense? Okay. I'm going to change this name. Okay. So I compile this, and now I can set its default value. I'm going to set it to like the equivalent of, so 0.01. Do that for now. Okay. So I want his health to go up every time a frame is generated. So I need to find an event that runs every time a frame is generated. So to do that, I right click and I would look for tick. An event tick is every single time a frame runs, it runs. So to do that, I would say I need a branch. So a branch is like an if statement. Oh, it closed. That's good. A branch is like an if statement in Java. So it has a condition, and if the condition passes, it runs, and false would be like the else statement for that. So I want to see if health is already at 1 or greater than 1, and I don't want to add to it then, so it doesn't go over the full capacity. So I can search greater than or equal to for a float and set this to 1. and then run this Boolean right here, because this right here is going to say, okay, is health greater than or equal to 1, and it's going to return true or false into that branch. So if health is greater than or equal to 1, this is going to return true, and if not, it's going to return false. So if it is greater than or equal to 1, then I don't want to run. But if it's not, I want it to first get set health, and I want it to increment health. So to do that, I'm going to get health again and add to it. So I'm going to add 0.1 to my health every second. Actually, I'm going to make this smaller because this runs faster than your eye can actually process. So I want to make it actually able to be seen. There. Okay. And then every time it does this isn't really a good practice to do in a final game, but in order to test to see if it's working, I'm going to have it print. So it's going to print the screen in the top left corner, and I'm going to have it print the current health, just to make sure it's running. This will convert between a float and a string, because that's the input of this. In general, if you're printing something or outputting to text, you can just drag the node that you want to print to it, and it'll say, oh, do you want to convert this? So it's pretty simple. It basically understands what you want even when you don't understand what you want, which is a lot of times for me. So I find that very helpful. So now that this is compiled and saved, I can close out of it and run in here and see how it's actually incrementing on the side. Slowly going up. And now, I think that rate's a little too slow. I think you guys probably agree with me, right? He's not really healing that fast. So the way I would fix that would be maybe get rid of one of these zeros. Make it a little bit greater of a value that I'm adding to it. Always make sure if you change something in your blueprint, just compile it right after, and then you should be good to go. And now, oh yeah, he's healing way faster now. See? There we go. Okay. Another example of what I wanted to show you guys is creating a blueprint class. So say I have an object I want to spawn with my character, then I'd make a blueprint class, and you're met with this menu that kind of looks intimidating because you're like, oh, what type do I want? For the most part, if you're creating an AI, you'd want it to be a pawn, because then you can have it possessed by an AI class. If you're creating another player character, of course you'd want it to be a character. And pretty much everything else would be an actor. Like say I want a loot bag, that'd be an actor. If I want some kind of object I can pick up and put into my inventory, that'd be an actor. Because the whole idea of an actor is that it can be placed in the world. So you need something that you can put a static mesh on, which is like a 3D model of something that doesn't move. A skeletal mesh is like what this character has right here, where it has bones and everything there. So basically a mesh with a skeleton that allows the mesh to actually move as you create animations. That makes sense, right? Okay, cool. So I'm going to create an actor called cube, and I'm going to give it a mesh. This is the viewport right here. So if you're creating any actual visual elements to your class or your person, if it's a person or a loot bag or whatever, you would go into here and you can add a static mesh right here. I'm going to call this cube. And now go over here. I'm going to add a cube to it. Simple as that. I think that's a little too big though, so I'm going to size it down a little bit. That's about right. Okay. Compile, save. So I want to get rid of when my player jumps and I want it to just spawn on him. I want this crate to just spawn beneath his feet. Just bare bones basic. So I'm going to take up here where it's actually setting him to jump. I'm going to take this, copy it, put it down here. So you remember how action events work. Every time that he presses space, this is going to run. So I want to spawn an actor on span. Spawn actor from class right here. So this needs an input of the actual class you want to spawn. So click this and look for the cube. Spawn in the cube. And then it needs a transform, which is essentially a location and a rotation. So it wants to know, okay, where do you want me to spawn? What direction do you want me to be facing? So we can do this by just... So I'm going to spawn it at his feet, facing the exact same direction that he's facing. And this should work. Good, it compiled, that's a good sign. There's a cube right beneath his feet. See? It's pretty simple. Do any of you guys have specific examples you'd want to learn how to do? Like this workshop can basically just be kind of formed around stuff that you've been having issues with. I know a lot of it is you guys come here with a question or something that you're having difficulty with, and we can all go over it and learn from it. That's kind of like the structure we're looking for. But if you don't have questions, you can obviously just come just to learn. Makes sense. Other than that, though, we don't really have much more to show you on Unreal basics. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them.
I'm curious about your game. I want to see what that looks like.
Okay. If it'll run on my computer, I will show you. Let's see. So right now, what my team is working on is our AI was already at the point where it would follow the character and try to run into him. So we, instead of developing a melee for that, because our primary character is already melee, we wanted to make a projectile AI that would stop when it's a certain distance away from the character and shoot at him. Because we thought that melee versus projectile is kind of more interesting than just melee versus melee, because at that point you're faced with the problem of, okay, do I want to make my enemy just really weak because there's going to be more of them, or do I want some kind of skill to actually hitting the character? So we thought projectile would be better in that case. So this is my game right now. I'm going to launch it actually. So it's going to have to generate shaders. So I can talk some more while it's doing that. Right now we have one character that is actually in rotation that's actually working. It's our paladin character that he has a flaming sword attack, a melee attack, a heal ability that spawns an emitter on the ground beneath his feet that heals him, obviously, uses mana, and yeah, that's really it right now.
When you said that we have our paladin is in full rotation, I think is what you said. What do you mean by that?
He's actually in the game right
Okay.
now. Essentially, we might develop another character for the game. We're not really sure yet, because we had a mage character, but it was kind of buggy in the sense that, because we don't have strafe movement, so you actually have to be walking in the direction you're facing, and that meant that the mage was always running away, stopping, turning around, attacking, then doing that again. With a projectile character, like a mage, it's a lot easier if you can run backwards and face the opposite direction you're running in. So this is our main menu. As you can see, I'm getting 3 frames per second. So that's always a good sign. We have our settings menu here. Different resolutions. That's about all we got to so far for that. I have new game and resume game because we have a save game option. So it actually saves your stats between plays. So this is the sword character. Picks up loot, levels up. Okay, and let me just show you the heal ability. Okay, this is what it looks like when he heals.
Where did you guys get the whole animations and like art? Did you guys make it yourself?
Okay, so Infinity Blade. Have you ever heard of the game?
Yeah.
Okay, well, they have about 16 gigabytes of assets that are free for Unreal Engine through the marketplace. Just search Infinity Blade, 2 words, you'll find it. Everything, almost everything in this game is from Infinity Blade's assets just because they're so good and they're optimized for mobile games, which is great. So they run very well, except on Macs, evidently. Then we have this thing right here that actually is a quest that will give me a random quest based on an array that we made of actual dynamic quests. So like this one would have been 2 strings. It would have been collect and drops, and it generates a random number in between for how many drops you collect, and then it multiplies that number by 10 to get the reward to give you. Down here, I'm going to turn on my flaming sword, and I'm just going to swing away. There you go. And they spawn loot bags beneath them. As you can see, the AI isn't very smart. Kind of just thinks I'm like still up there because they can't see me because it's based on vision and not hearing. And their vision cone is very small. Very small. So yeah, and then I have a resets button in my pause menu. And it resets my stats. So yeah, that's about it with our game. You guys have any other questions? We've been putting back up the question slide. Feel free, go ahead.
Is this PowerPoint going to be like available to us?
If you want it to be, we can upload it to like Google
Slack.
Drive or something like that. Or we can put it on Slack too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna send it to the general chat right now.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yep.
So is there a list of any kind of free asset sites or something like that?
What kind of assets are you looking for?
Just in general.
Okay, so if you want 3D models and animations, mixamo.com. I think it's still owned by Adobe.
Yeah.
They have
Part of the creator suite.
Yeah, they have tons of free 3D models. The only problem is if you use a Mixamo model, you can't sell your game because they own the rights to your model. Make sense?
Yeah.
So if you just want to make a game for fun though, Mixamo is great. And all of our models in our game are from Mixamo. So that's a good place to start. If you want materials, it's pretty hard because graphic designers don't like to give out free materials for some reason. I've had a lot of trouble. Like, I can't even find a place to get like a dirt material. You would think that'd be way easier. So I'd say for materials, they don't really matter towards the beginning. I'd stick more so towards mechanics and models. And later down the line, when you want to develop like a grass material, wall material, stuff like that, go through tutorials for that. Because generating materials is actually a lot easier than it sounds because it's just blueprints also. It's just graphic blueprints. So like your nodes inside the blueprint would be like opacity, alpha level, RGB. Like, okay, I want to take this UV from this image and put it into that node. That's about the gist of what I understand for materials. It's complex, but it's the same system as blueprints with like drag and drop and connecting nodes.